The year's 1801, and Thomas Jefferson stands before a crowd of anxious Americans, his words cutting through the humid Virginia air like a blade through silk. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. But what Jefferson doesn't know, what none of them know, is that America is about to face something far more dangerous than any foreign enemy or domestic rebellion. The nation is about to confront the collapse of its religious foundation, and the very soul of the republic hangs in the balance. It begins not with gunfire or proclamations, but with whispers in dimly lit taverns and heated arguments in church pews. The year 1800 has just passed, and with it, the most apocalyptic prediction in American history has failed to materialize. The Millerites, followers of a Baptist preacher named William Miller, had calculated with mathematical precision that Christ would return to earth between March 21st, 1843, and March 21st, 1844. They sold their possessions, donned white robes, and climbed hills to await their ascension to heaven. When the sun set on March 21st, 1844, and they remained firmly planted on earthly soil, something fundamental broke in the American psyche. But this story doesn't begin in 1844. It begins decades earlier in the mind of a farmer turned preacher whose careful study of biblical prophecy would inadvertently trigger the first great religious crisis in American history. William Miller was not a charlatan or a madman. He was a methodical, educated man who applied the same rigorous logic he used to calculate crop yields to the mysterious numbers scattered throughout the book of Daniel and Revelation. Born in 1782 in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, Miller had served as a captain in the War of 1812, witnessed the burning of Washington, D.C., and returned home a skeptic. The carnage he'd seen had shaken his faith, turning him toward deism, the belief that God had created the world but then stepped back, leaving humanity to its own devices. For years, Miller wrestled with doubt until a profound religious experience in 1816 brought him back to Christianity with a vengeance. But this wasn't the gentle faith of Sunday morning hymns. This was biblical archaeology with eternal consequences. Miller became obsessed with a passage in Daniel 8:14. "And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed." Using the biblical principle that one prophetic day equals one literal year, Miller calculated that 2,300 years from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem in 457 BC would bring them to 1843. The mathematics were elegant, the logic seemed sound, and Miller's certainty was infectious. By the early 1840s, his message had spread like wildfire across New England and beyond. Newspapers estimated that between 50,000 to 100,000 Americans, roughly 1 in every 200 people, believed the world would end within Miller's predicted time frame. They called themselves Adventists, believers in the second advent of Christ, and their faith wasn't merely intellectual, it was visceral, transformative, all-consuming. Sarah Miner was 19 years old when she first heard Miller preach in a packed meeting house in Rochester, New York. Years later, she would write in her diary, "His words fell upon us like hammer blows, each calculation driving deeper the nail of certainty. I saw my neighbors weeping, not from sorrow, but from joy so pure it seemed to burn. We were the chosen generation, the final witnesses. Death had no sting because we would never taste it." The Millerite movement tapped into something deeper than mere religious enthusiasm. America in the 1840s was a nation in flux, grappling with rapid industrialization, westward expansion, and growing tensions over slavery. Traditional communities were fracturing, families scattered by opportunity and ambition. The promise of imminent divine intervention offered both hope and resolution, a cosmic reset button that would solve every earthly problem. As the predicted date approached, Millerite communities transformed into apocalyptic communes. Farmers abandoned their crops, arguing that there was no point in harvesting what they wouldn't live to eat. Merchants sold their goods at a loss, converting everything to cash they could distribute to the poor. Children were pulled from schools deemed unnecessary for souls about to meet their Maker. In some communities, civil authority nearly collapsed as believers withdrew from secular society entirely. The movement attracted people from all social classes, but it held particular appeal for women and the working poor, those with the least stake in the existing social order. Mary Baker Eddy, who would later found Christian Science, was deeply influenced by Millerite thought during her youth. So was Ellen White, the future founder of Seventh-day Adventism. The movement gave voice and agency to people traditionally marginalized in religious settings, allowing women to preach and prophesy in ways that mainstream denominations forbade. But perhaps most remarkably, the Millerites maintained their composure even as the final hours approached. There were no mass suicides, no violent confrontations with authorities, no descent into madness. They simply gathered, prayed, and waited with a dignity that would make their eventual disappointment all the more profound. The first predicted date, March 21st, 1843, passed without incident. Miller quickly recalculated, extending the window to March 21st, 1844. When that date also passed uneventfully, a follower named Samuel Snow performed his own calculations and identified October 22nd, 1844, as the true date of Christ's return. This became known as the True Midnight Cry, and it reinvigorated the movement with desperate intensity. October 22nd, 1844, dawned clear and crisp across the northeastern United States. In countless homes, families knelt in prayer circles, their faces turned toward windows that would reveal either Christ's glorious return or their own devastating mistake. Hiram Edson, a Millerite leader from New York, later described the day, "We sat through the long hours, our hearts beating in rhythm with eternity itself. Every cloud seemed to promise his approach, every distant sound the trumpet of judgment. But the sun traced its familiar arc and shadows lengthened as they had for countless generations before." As darkness fell on October 22nd, something died in American religious consciousness. The failure wasn't merely of a prediction. It was the collapse of a methodology that had seemed so certain, so mathematically precise. If careful biblical scholarship could lead to such spectacular error, what could be trusted? The event became known as the Great Disappointment, but that gentle term hardly captures the psychological devastation that followed. Washington Morse, a Millerite from Massachusetts, wrote to his brother, "I am left like a man who has learned that his entire life has been a dream, and now must learn to walk in a world that seems foreign and strange. My faith lies in pieces around me, each fragment sharp enough to draw blood." Many believers experienced what psychologists would now recognize as collective trauma. They had reorganized their entire existence around a cosmic event that simply hadn't occurred. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Some Millerites, unable to accept that they had been wrong, developed elaborate theological explanations. Christ had indeed returned, they argued, but to a heavenly sanctuary invisible to earthly eyes, a doctrine that would become central to Seventh-day Adventist theology. Others concluded that their calculations had been off by just a few years and began new countdown sequences. Still others abandoned Christianity entirely, their faith shattered beyond repair. But the impact extended far beyond the Millerite community itself. For the first time in American history, a religious movement of significant size had failed so spectacularly and so publicly that it called into question the very nature of religious authority. If respected ministers could be so utterly wrong about matters of ultimate concern, what did that say about religious truth itself? The Great Disappointment became America's first great crisis of religious epistemology, a challenge not just to what people believed, but to how they determined what was worth believing. Traditional denominations responded with a mixture of sympathy and satisfaction. Methodist and Baptist ministers who had opposed Miller's date setting felt vindicated, but also recognized that the crisis had wounded American Protestantism as a whole. The Catholic Church, still a minority presence in 1844, saw the Millerite failure as evidence of Protestant theological instability and used it in their missionary efforts among disillusioned believers. The secular press had a field day. The New York Herald ran a cartoon showing Miller with his head in his hands, surrounded by disciples in white robes with the caption, "The prophet of doom becomes the prophet of gloom." But beneath the mockery lay genuine concern about the social implications of mass religious disillusionment. In the weeks following October 22nd, crime rates spiked in communities with large Millerite populations. Some former believers, having given away their possessions and neglected their responsibilities, turned to theft and fraud. Others fell into deep depression, with several documented suicides attributed directly to the Great Disappointment. The crisis revealed how thoroughly religious faith had been woven into the fabric of American social order and what happened when that fabric suddenly tore. Joshua Himes, Miller's most effective publicist, tried to maintain organizational cohesion in the movement's aftermath. He organized conferences where former Millerites could process their disappointment and explore new theological directions. But these gatherings often devolved into bitter arguments between those who maintained some form of Adventist faith and those who felt betrayed by the entire enterprise. The theological creativity that emerged from this chaos was remarkable. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, founded by Ellen White and others, developed a complex theology that preserved Miller's basic methodology while explaining the Great Disappointment as a heavenly event invisible to human observation. The Advent Christian Church maintained belief in Christ's eventual return but rejected date-setting entirely. Other groups explored universalism, spiritualism, and various forms of restorationism. Perhaps most significantly, the Great Disappointment contributed to the rise of religious liberalism in American Protestantism. If literal biblical interpretation could lead to such obvious error, perhaps Scripture required more sophisticated hermeneutical approaches. The movement toward higher criticism, social gospel theology, and denominational modernization that would characterize late 19th century American religion can be traced in part to the theological crisis of 1844. The intellectual elite responded to the Millerite failure with a mixture of scientific triumphalism and philosophical reflection. Ralph Waldo Emerson, writing in his journal, observed, "The Miller delusion shows us how desperate men become when they try to imprison the infinite within the finite calculations of human reason. Perhaps the greater delusion is thinking we can calculate God at all." But perhaps you're wondering, where are you watching this from right now? Are you in your living room on a quiet Sunday afternoon? Or maybe listening during your commute to work? And what's your profession? Are you a teacher, an engineer, a student trying to understand how religious movements shape history? I'm curious because the story of the Great Disappointment reminds us that ordinary people, farmers, merchants, mothers, children, can become part of extraordinary historical moments that reshape entire cultures. The economic consequences of the Great Disappointment rippled through American society in unexpected ways. Insurance companies reported an unusual number of claims from people who had neglected property maintenance in anticipation of the end times. Agricultural regions experienced localized food shortages because Millerite farmers had abandoned their harvest preparations. The emerging railroad industry actually benefited as disillusioned believers sought new opportunities in distant cities, driving demand for transportation. One of the most fascinating aspects of the crisis was how it accelerated the professionalization of American clergy. The spectacular failure of Miller's calculations led mainstream denominations to emphasize formal theological education as a safeguard against such errors. Seminary enrollment increased dramatically in the 1850s as churches sought ministers trained in careful biblical scholarship rather than charismatic enthusiasm. The Great Disappointment also marked the beginning of America's complex relationship with religious expertise. On one hand, the failure of Miller's careful calculations led to skepticism about any claims to prophetic knowledge. On the other hand, it created a hunger for more sophisticated theological understanding that could prevent similar embarrassments. This tension would play out repeatedly in American religious history, from the fundamentalist modernist controversy of the early 20th century to contemporary debates about science and faith. Women played a particularly interesting role in the post-disappointment religious landscape. Many female Millerites had experienced unprecedented religious authority within the movement, serving as preachers, prophets, and organizational leaders. When traditional denominations proved reluctant to maintain these expanded roles, many women gravitated toward new religious movements that preserved gender equality in spiritual matters. Ellen White's emergence as the prophetic leader of Seventh-day Adventism was just the most visible example of this pattern. The psychological literature on religious disappointment, which began to develop in response to the Millerite crisis, identified several common patterns. Some believers experienced what researchers called cognitive dissonance reduction, modifying their beliefs just enough to preserve their core faith while explaining away the failed prediction. Others underwent meaning reconstruction, completely rebuilding their worldview from the ground up. Still others developed what might be called spiritual cynicism, maintaining religious observance while privately abandoning genuine belief. Dr. Amariah Brigham, superintendent of the New York State Lunatic Asylum, published a study in 1845 documenting the psychological effects of the Great Disappointment. He found that former Millerites exhibited higher rates of depression, anxiety, and what he termed religious melancholy than the general population. But he also noted remarkable resilience, with many subjects eventually developing more nuanced and personally satisfying forms of faith. The ripple effects extended into American literature and philosophy as well. Herman Melville's later works show clear influence from the theological crisis of the 1840s, particularly his exploration of faith and doubt in Moby Dick and Billy Budd. Henry David Thoreau's retreat to Walden Pond was partly motivated by his observation of how completely religion could dominate and then abandon human life. Even Walt Whitman's expansive spiritual democracy can be understood as a response to the failure of organized prophetic religion. The Great Disappointment also influenced American political culture in subtle but important ways. The Millerite movement had drawn heavily from the same populist impulses that would later fuel Jacksonian democracy and various reform movements. When that energy couldn't be channeled toward apocalyptic expectations, it flowed into anti-slavery activism, women's rights advocacy, and other social causes. Many historians argue that the failure of religious perfectionism actually accelerated secular perfectionism in American reform culture. International observers watched the American religious crisis with fascination and concern. European intellectuals like Alexis de Tocqueville had already identified religion as crucial to American democratic culture. The Great Disappointment raised questions about whether American society could maintain its moral foundation if religious authority proved so unreliable. These concerns would influence European critiques of American culture for decades to come. By the 1850s, American society had largely absorbed the lessons of the Great Disappointment, but those lessons continued to shape religious culture in profound ways. The experience had demonstrated both the power and the danger of mass religious enthusiasm. It had shown how quickly religious certainty could collapse and how creatively believers could rebuild their faith from the ruins of disappointed expectations. The movement also established patterns that would recur throughout American religious history. The combination of biblical literalism with mathematical precision that characterized Miller's approach would reappear in various forms of dispensationalism and prophetic speculation. The demographic appeal to women and the marginalized would characterize many later religious movements. Most importantly, the Great Disappointment established America's peculiar tolerance for religious innovation and reinvention in the face of doctrinal failure. Perhaps most significantly, the crisis of 1844 began the long process of separating American religious identity from specific doctrinal commitments. If respected believers could be so thoroughly wrong about fundamental questions, then perhaps faith was more about community, practice, and personal experience than about theological precision. This insight would eventually contribute to America's distinctive religious pluralism and its ability to accommodate seemingly contradictory forms of faith within a single society. The children of Millerites grew up with a unique perspective on religious authority and certainty. Many became leaders in various reform movements, bringing both skepticism toward grand claims and appreciation for genuine spiritual seeking. Others became prominent in academic fields, particularly history and psychology, perhaps driven by their childhood experience of living through such a dramatic example of how beliefs shape reality, and how reality can shatter beliefs. As we look back on the Great Disappointment from our contemporary perspective, it's tempting to see it simply as an early example of American religious eccentricity. But that interpretation misses the profound ways in which this crisis shaped the development of American religious culture. The failure of the Millerite prediction forced Americans to develop more sophisticated ways of thinking about religious truth, prophetic authority, and the relationship between faith and knowledge. The Great Disappointment also established America as the first modern society to experience mass religious disillusionment without descending into either sectarian violence or complete secular nihilism. The resilience that American believers showed in the face of such spectacular theological failure became a model for how religious societies could adapt to changing intellectual and social circumstances while preserving their spiritual vitality. If you're finding this exploration of America's first great religious crisis as fascinating as I am, and if Professor Archive has earned a spot among your favorite educational channels, consider showing your support with a super thanks. It really helps us continue bringing these hidden chapters of history to light. Today, as Americans continue to grapple with questions about religious authority, prophetic claims, and the role of faith in public life, the story of William Miller and his followers remains remarkably relevant. The Great Disappointment reminds us that religious belief is not simply a private matter, but a social force with profound consequences for how communities organize themselves and plan for the future. It also demonstrates the remarkable human capacity to rebuild meaning from the fragments of shattered certainty. The Millerite crisis was America's first encounter with the modern problem of religious authority in a pluralistic society. How do you distinguish between genuine spiritual insight and dangerous delusion? How do communities respond when widely accepted religious teachings prove catastrophically wrong? How does a society maintain its moral foundation when the sources of that foundation are called into question? These questions, first raised by the Great Disappointment of 1844, continue to shape American religious and cultural life. They remind us that faith and doubt, certainty and questioning, disappointment and renewal are not opposing forces, but rather the complementary dynamics that drive the ongoing evolution of human spiritual understanding. In learning to live with that tension, perhaps Americans developed one of their most distinctive and valuable cultural traits: the ability to hold strongly to beliefs while remaining open to the possibility that those beliefs might need to change. The Great Disappointment was indeed America's first religious collapse, but it was also the beginning of a new kind of religious maturity, one that could accommodate both profound faith and profound questioning within the same cultural space. In that sense, William Miller's failed prediction succeeded in ways he never could have imagined, helping to create a society where spiritual seeking could continue, even after spiritual certainty had been shattered. And perhaps that's the most American lesson of all: that endings can become beginnings, that failures can become foundations, and that even the greatest disappointments can open the door to deeper wisdom. As the sun sets on our journey through this pivotal moment in American religious history, we're reminded that the search for meaning and transcendence continues in every generation, shaped by the failures and successes of those who came before. The Millerites may not have witnessed the end of the world, but they witnessed the end of one way of being religious in America and the beginning of countless others. In that transformation, we can still hear the echoes of their white-robed vigil on that distant October night, when disappointment became the doorway to a more complex and ultimately more resilient form of American faith.